British Empire, a symbol of national identity, pride and culture, as well as a symbol of vast wealth, power, oppression, greed, colonisation, slavery, suffering and death. There has been scandals, affairs, unexplained accidents, but is it a fair generalisation or am I being too harsh? Well, in today's video we're going to be looking at the good and the bad of the British Empire. I think it's important to point out as well that the history of the monarchy is a complex and long one, so I won't be touching upon everything that has happened. This video will be factual in terms of the history, but it's also an opinion piece as well. So it's just important for me to mention that this is not a personal attack on anyone who is a fan of the monarchy or is a citizen in the UK. This is purely about the monarchy and the system that the monarchy represents. But first, what is the monarchy in the UK? Well, the British monarchy is a hereditary sovereign reigning as a head of state of the United Kingdom. As the monarchy is constitutional, the monarch is limited to functions such as bestowing honours and appointing the Prime Minister, which are performed kind of in a non-partisan manner. The sovereign is also able to comment on draft laws which directly affect the monarchy. They also undertake various official and ceremonial and representational responsibilities. The British royal family's reign spans for over 37 generations and over 1,209 years. So if you're lucky enough to be born into this monarchy, you're pretty much set for life. And I think it's important to talk about some of the, the positives of the empire, the positives that the British Empire has had on the world and on its own country. So first of all, the British Empire is responsible for building modern infrastructure in many of its colonies, including roads, railways, ports and communication services. The infrastructure helped to connect different regions and stimulate economic growth that are still in use to this day. The British Empire also helped to spread education around the world. In many of its colonies, the British established schools and university, which provided access to education for people that mightn't have gotten it otherwise. And many of these institutions exist to this day and continue to provide education to their citizens. The British Empire also introduced modern legal systems to many of its colonies, which helped to establish the rule of law and protect the rights of citizens of each colony. These legal systems helped to lay the foundation of modern democracies, which are in many parts of the world today, including my own country of Ireland. And also, of course, the big one being that the English language. The English language is one of the most spoken languages around the world, and it's the official languages in many countries now. So it's fair to say that there has been some positives over the British controlled areas over the last few centuries. But unfortunately, the negatives, in my opinion, outweigh the positives in this case, as the empire are responsible for countless atrocities throughout its histories, and here are a few of the examples of this. So the British Empire is built on the exploitation and oppression of many people and nations. The empire was founded on the principle of mercantilism, which meant that the British government sought to extract as much wealth as it possibly could from each of its colonies. And this actually meant, unfortunately, exploiting national resources, exploiting local labour, and enforcing discriminatory policies that favoured British settlers over the people who were actually from the countries they invaded. The British Empire was also involved in forced labour and indentured servitude of millions of people around the world. This included, of course, enslavement of millions of Africans, as well as other slaves in India, China and other parts of Asia. They also had a significant impact on the cultural heritage of many of these colonies. In some cases, the British government actually actively, as well as the royals, actively sought to erase or suppress indigenous cultures, languages and religions. And in other cases, the destruction of cultural heritage was the unintended consequence of policies like land exploitation and forced migration. They also created a lot of political conflict and instability, and often relied on authoritarian rules to maintain control over its colonies, which led to the suppression of democratic movements and the establishment of dictator regimes. Also, I think it's important to mention as well that there are numerous cultural artifacts that have been taken from many countries by British Empire and British royals that are, subject of ongoing debates and whether they should be returned back to their countries. In fact, some people even stating that they will be better maintained and taken care of in Britain rather than in their home territories. Some examples of this would be, for example, the Rosetta Stone, which was an ancient Egyptian artifact that was discovered by French soldiers in 1799 and was later taken by the British during the occupation of Egypt in the early 19th century. It is now displayed in the British Museum, and the ownership remains a subject of dispute between Egypt and the UK. And many argue that the return of these artifacts is a matter of historical justice and respect for the cultures and the people that they were taken from. Despite this, to this day there are countless more artifacts that are in possession of the Brits, who do not wish to return them to their owners. Now, to kind of get a bit more specific, one of the things I want to talk about in a bit more detail is the African slavery. Slavery in Africa existed before they came over to their shores. However, this does not excuse the level of suffering and death caused by the British Empire and the British monarchy. British traders transported and enslaved Africans from the coast of West and Central Africa to the Americas, where they were sold into bondage. British companies and traders played a role in the capture and sale of slaves in Africa, and often in concert with local African rulers. The impact of this brutal trade on African societies was devastating. Families were torn apart, communities completely destroyed, and it's actually really difficult to get an exact figure, I found, in terms of the amount of slaves that were traded and transported by the British Empire, but it's over the centuries, it's estimated to be in the millions. I think it's fair as an Irish person to mention a bit of historical relevance to Ireland and the UK, considering there's a period of 800 years where British ruled over my country, and that also did bring some oppression and some horrible acts and atrocities that I feel are important to mention, just to give a bit more context as to my perspective as an Irish person. One of the things I wanted to talk about was the Great Famine, which occurred during the years 1845 to 1852, where over 1 million Irish people died, as well as 1 million people left the country. Now, this occurred because Irish people were forced to basically have a diet of mostly just potatoes, and unfortunately when a blight hit the potato crops, which caused them to fail for years and years, because we had no other source of food, it basically created a famine. So Irish people were starving to death, and the British government, as well as the British monarchy at the time, had a very laissez-faire way of looking at it, and they kind of decided to let it sort itself out. They continued to export food out of the country, which was very much needed considering people were starving to death. And they also had a system called famine roads, where they forced Irish people to build roads to go nowhere, just to distract them, just to basically almost quicken the death toll. They didn't really care, and it was a tragedy that was a genocidal tragedy that was totally avoidable. So it does leave a bit of a sour taste in the mouth. The reason I'm kind of explaining this story is because obviously I have some bias about the British monarchy and the British Empire because of how my country was treated for so long. I have some issues with the British monarchy because of what occurred during that time period. And to me, that's why the monarchy is a symbol of oppression and hate and murder and suffering, because they allowed so many people die in my country when they could have came in and helped, which is why Ireland eventually would find independence in some form later in the 19th century. So how do British people feel about the monarchy? Well, my own personal opinion on that is that I would argue that the idea of the monarchy is so indoctrinated into them at such a young age, where it's so ingrained in their culture that it's like a religion. Like, you're brought up in it. You know, it's something that you're supposed to look upon with pride and to see the power of the monarchy and what it represents. And to be fair to a lot of British people, they're not really told in school the level of atrocities that have occurred in their history. So to them, a lot of the time, you know, the British crown is a symbol of power and pride and cultural identity. That being said, last year, of course, we all know Queen Elizabeth II died after being 70 years in power, who has now since been replaced by her son, who has now been made king in May of this year, but now King Charles III. And there was some backlash during the coronation, which I should mention cost 100 million taxpayer pounds for it to occur. But there was some backlash when the British public were called upon to swear allegiance to the king, and the British government did later clarify that it was an invitation to participate rather than an actual expectation, which kind of gives you an idea of how, you know, British people feel about the monarchy at the minute. Now, that being said, the coronation was celebrated by millions around the UK, and it did bring a sense of joy and pride to the British people, which has a positive effect on their culture and their society. But at the same time, there is a growing complex views towards the monarchy. A recent study found by the British pollster by the name of YouGov showed that the support for the monarchy has dropped from 64% to 58%, and young people in particular aren't as influenced by the monarchy. Another important thing to note as well, that during the coronation itself, there was a lot of anti-monarchists protesting against the whole idea of the coronation, and a lot of people were arrested for that. Like, in the UK, it's legal to protest, so the fact that people were protesting the monarchy and they were arrested by police is a bit worrying. And I believe that the reason why they're protesting the monarchy is because they don't feel like a monarchy is relevant in the modern world. The fact that it costs the British taxpayer over $500 million a year just to maintain the monarchy and to pay for their expenses, even though the monarchy themselves are worth a staggering £34.3 billion. Now, the royal family does generate £2.5 billion per year in tourism into the UK, and I believe that the biggest issue though is that some of the unjust wealth, and also the fact that they're a symbol of colonisation and slavery and debt, and we can see the hypocrisy of the royals when it comes to the likes of Prince Andrew, obviously, who was famously friends with Jeffrey Epstein, and he was accused of doing some pretty fucked up things, as well as, you know, Princess Diana, who was well adored by the British people, who wanted to divorce Prince Charles at that time in the 90s and mysteriously died in a crash in France. Now, of course, you know, the official statement is that, you know, it was ruled an accident, and multiple investigations have been done since then, and there hasn't really been any real proof to believe otherwise, so I can't really say for sure, I can only speculate. But I think the biggest issue is the massive wealth inequality in the country throughout the different, you know, classes in its own borders, like especially with the likes of, you know, inflation and the housing crisis, and especially the new law with student debt that's come in the UK, where the government aren't contributing as much as they used to, meaning that the UK students are going to be paying their debt for an extra possibly 10 years because of this. I think it's very insulting to the British people who work hard, who pay their taxes, a huge chunk of which go to the monarchy, just to see these people who are there just as a symbol, who are worth over 30 billion, who take $500 million worth of taxes every year for themselves. I mean, I think it's just a bit insulting for them who are struggling to survive day in or day out, while these people live in vast wealth and they don't really contribute much besides the money they bring in for tourism. That being said, I'd like to ask my friends here, the UK friends of mine, you know, what do you guys think? How do you feel about the monarchy? Do you think it's an important part of British society? Do you think that, you know, the money that you give to them in taxes is justified for the amount of money that they give in terms of tourism to the country? Do you see them for what they are as well? Do you see them as a source of inequality, as a source of classism, as a source of oppression? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to know kind of like how close to the wire I am with this, and or if I'm just totally, you know, blowing smoke and nothing. Like, I'd love to know if the general representation of my views kind of match some of the people that live over there, because to me it seems a bit crazy that the British monarchy still has so much influence and so much wealth during a time period where people, especially in the UK, are suffering. People can't get houses, people can't pay for their petrol, people can't get homes. Just very similar things that are in Ireland, but we don't have a monarchy that is vastly wealthy, and to me it's just very insulting. As always, thanks so much for watching. It's always very much appreciated. This video obviously is very brief. There's way more complex layers to this topic, but I kind of just wanted to touch on it like kind of in kind of a generalized, non-specific way at some points, just because it's very long, complicated. Hopefully I've covered kind of generally enough to kind of give a good basis for my argument. And again, just to reiterate, you know, this isn't about attacking anyone that lives in the UK, or this isn't attacking anyone that follows or supports British monarchy. This is just about what they represent to me and their relevancy today in the world. As always, guys, thanks so much for watching. I will see you in the next video. Peace out.